Most people, if they believe in it, think of heaven as a remote place, separate from the earth, that you go to after you die, depending on whether you have lived a virtuous life. However, there are some who, like the Fleetwood Mac song, believe that heaven is a place on earth. There are a number of religions who believe in a physical, earthly heaven, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons. But today I want to focus on the Orthodox Jewish version, which is prominent in the Orthodox Jewish group Chabad Lubavitch. Despite the large amount of jaceberging on certain sections of the internet, increasing most notably after October 7th and the liberalization of Twitter, there is very little awareness among the Gentiles into the actual religious beliefs and frameworks that underlie modern Orthodox Judaism. This is unsurprising, really. Judaism is an extremely complex and dense religion, and unlike Christianity, it is discursive rather than declarative, which is to say that, unlike Christianity, whose principles are declared and not open to much interpretation, despite what modern incarnations of woke Christianity may have you believe, Judaism, interpreted through the Talmud, is fundamentally discursive, which is to say that it is a collection of legal arguments between various Jewish scholars that does not strictly come to one interpretation. If it does, the minority positions and interpretations are still left in the text. A good way to imagine the difference between Christianity and Judaism in its text is the difference between the American Constitution and the UK Constitution. The US Constitution is a series of declarations, hard and fast rules that are open to limited interpretation by the courts, while the UK Constitution, which is a, quote, living document, is based upon a web of legal precedent and is constantly changing. Islam sits midway between the two, being simultaneously declarative through the Quran and discursive through the Hadith. Jewish philosophy and mysticism is also famously impenetrable, and Jewish scholars have pointed to a specific kind of Jewish thought that lends itself to argumentation and discourse. In this video, I want to examine a particular strain of Jewish religious thought, physical messianism. The Jewish idea of heaven is significantly different to the Christian conception. Unlike the Christian conception of heaven or the afterlife, the Jewish conception is that of the Olam Haba, or, quote, the world to come. Like many things in Judaism, what it means exactly is different depending on which strain of Judaism you are referring to. But here I want to focus on the beliefs of the Chabad Lubavitchers and their concept that the world to come is an actual physical world in the future of mankind. Unlike the Christians, who believe that heaven is a place wholly removed from this earth, Chabad believes that the world to come will actually be manifested in this world after the coming of the Mashiach, the Jewish Messiah. Another significant difference between Jewish and Christian messianic thought is the idea in Judaism that those of us alive now can in fact influence the likelihood of the Messiah returning with their actions. The Christian view on the return of the Messiah is best summed up by the quote from Matthew 24:36, summed up usually as "No man knows the day or the hour," quote, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." And although Christians are told to be watchful for signs of God's return, they do not believe that the timing of this event can be influenced by their actions. This is in stark contrast to certain strains of Judaism, which has a number of prophetic beliefs about events which must be fulfilled by man in order for the Mashiach to return. There is some disagreement on the exact order of these events, and indeed I could make an entire other video on the Jewish debate on this subject. However, broadly, it is agreed that there must be a wide acceptance of Torah studies, the rebuilding of the Third Temple, the ingathering of the exiles, where all the Jews in the world return to Israel, and the return of the prophet Elijah, who will announce the Mashiach's return. The order of these events is also highly disputed. Why is this important? Well, the idea of the physical world to come and the Mashiach's return being preceded by specific events that can be engineered by humans opens the possibility of Jewish groups deliberately engineering events in the world in order to bring about this outcome. The building of the Third Temple and the red heifer are probably the best known examples of this. This provides a powerful lens for interpreting the actions of both Israel as a state and other Jewish groups in understanding actions that may seem incomprehensible to Gentiles. The adoption of ideologies that seek to fundamentally change the world are always dangerous, and when combined with religion, they can be even more so. There are a number of different interpretations of the Olam Haba, the world to come. For example, Saadia Gaon, in his 8th century work, The Book of Beliefs and Opinions, argued for the physical resurrection of the dead on earth as a reward for the righteous, while Maimonides argued in the 12th century Mishnah Torah that the Olam Haba is a purely spiritual state, where the soul, freed from the body, experiences eternal intellectual communion with God. This contrasts with the physical resurrection emphasized by earlier rabbis. This would come after the Messianic age, an era of worldly physical peace in which the world would be ruled by the Mashiach. This idea that the Jews as a whole can engineer the right circumstances for the coming of the Mashiach has penetrated deep even into Reform Judaism, which is the kind of vague, open-ended religion believed in by many Jews who are functionally very close to agnosticism in the idea that there is a God, but he is the universe or some other vague systemic force. This idea is the Tikkun Olam, or repairing the world, which embraces such ideas as social justice as an expansive ideology encompassing the idea that the Jews are the people chosen to repair the world, and that they know how to do this. One danger of these kinds of expansive beliefs is how the idea of the Tikkun Olam can easily be translated into socialism due to its emphasis on social justice, equality, and a vision of a perfected society. The idea of repairing the world through collective effort and transforming human nature aligns with communist goals of eliminating inequality and fostering cooperation. However, of course, it should be noted that communism, at least in the USSR version, is secular and materialist. So, according to Chabad, what would this world to come look like? Well, after the rebuilding of the Third Temple would come the re-establishment of the Sanhedrin, the world court, essentially. This would symbolize the flourishing of Judaism in the world. The Great Sanhedrin would be based in Jerusalem and would be a world court that would provide guidance to many Gentile courts around the world, so that all Gentiles will follow the 7 Noahide laws. The 7 Noahide laws, which must be obeyed by all Gentiles, is derived from Genesis 9 and elaborated in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 56a to b. They are: do not worship idols, the prohibition of idolatry. This law prevents the worship of gods, of idols, false gods, or any form of polytheism. It emphasizes the belief in one God, the creator of the universe. The second law is do not curse God, the prohibition of blasphemy. This law forbids cursing or blaspheming God's name. It requires respect and reverence for the divine. The third is do not murder. This law prohibits the unlawful taking of human life. Of course, this very much depends on who is making the law here. It must be stressed. It underscores the sanctity of life and the importance of preserving it. It is worth noting here that what constitutes lawful murder in this case is entirely under the interpretation of Jewish law. So, for example, a Gentile is allowed to kill in self-defense or in a defensive war, but the Jews are allowed to be aggressive in the pursuit of Amalek, which is basically defined as the eternal Jewish enemy. Do not commit adultery or sexual immorality. This law forbids adultery, incest, bestiality, homosexuality, and other forms of sexual immorality as defined by Jewish tradition. It promotes the sanctity of family and moral relationships. Do not steal, the prohibition of theft. This law prohibits stealing, including robbery, fraud, and any form of unjustly taking of another person's property. This law is also clearly open to interpretation based upon who is looking at it. And the final law is not to eat flesh torn from a living animal. This law forbids the consumption of flesh taken from an animal whilst it is still alive, emphasizing humane treatment of animals and proper slaughter practices. This underlies kosher slaughter. And the final law is the establishment of courts of justice. This law mandates the establishment of courts and legal systems to enforce the other 6 laws, ensuring justice, fairness, and social order. It is only, however, the Gentiles who need to obey the Noahide laws. For the Jews, there are instead the 613 commandments, or mitzvot, of the Torah. It should be obvious to the astute listener that there are many possible loopholes for abuse in the framing of these laws, since the determination of what is just or unjust would fall either to the Gentile courts being guided by the Sanhedrin, or to the Sanhedrin itself in the case of Jewish matters. However, for the Christians, it is the law against idolatry that is particularly troubling. Under Noahide law, such things as belief in the Trinity, veneration of the cross, and indeed even wearing a cross could be defined as idolatry under the strict interpretation. It should also be noted that the Noahide laws are seen as a set of universal laws that apply to everyone on earth, regardless of religion, with the Jews getting special dispensation. Of course. Even more troubling is the shades of exclusion inherent in this interpretation, echoing the modern idea that certain people, quote, have no place in our society. From the Mishnah Sanhedrin 10:1, all Israel has a share in the world to come, but certain transgressors, for example heretics and idolaters, are excluded, indicating a belief in individual accountability and reward. According to the strict interpretation of Maimonides, belief in the Trinity, venerating the cross, or even believing in the divinity of Jesus could be seen as idolatry. Depending on the interpretation of the Sanhedrin, these practices may even attract the death penalty, although it is stated that prison, discussion, and rehabilitation are preferred. There are, of course, more lenient interpretations, but this merely emphasizes my earlier point that it is very much a gamble as to which interpretation would be chosen by the Sanhedrin to guide the world system of Gentile courts when it is re-established. So to sum up, the coming of the Mashiach would result in the establishment of the Sanhedrin that would rule the entire world from Jerusalem through a series of courts that would enforce the Noahide laws on the world of the Gentiles, and depending on the interpretation, use lax or harsh punishment to ensure compliance. Needless to say, the possible authoritarian outcomes from such a system are easily seen, particularly in regard to Christianity, and even more particularly in regard to the Orthodox Christians. Examining the literature, there seems to be a trick being played here, that as long as the Gentiles submit, there will be peace, but if they do not, there will be war. It is assumed by some writers that the coming of the Mashiach and the, quote, universal knowledge of God will naturally lead the whole world into willful compliance with minimal violence. However, those of a more realistic bent will realize how unlikely this outcome is, and the definition of voluntary adoption is very vague. Christians and Muslims are expected to voluntarily abandon their traditions and convert to Noahide Judaism. If significant numbers of people refuse to comply, this could easily shift from persuasion to coercion to violence in order to preserve utopian goals, undermining the promise of voluntarism. Maimonides' Hilkot Melachim 11:4 states that the Messiah will, quote, motivate all the nations to serve God together, but does not specify how this motivation will be enforced if met with widespread refusal. A most amusing endpoint to this discussion is the question of the Christian Zionists, who believe that the restoration of Israel is one of the stepping stones to the return of the Christian Messiah. Christian Zionism was heavily influenced and subverted by Judaism, mainly through the publishing of the Schofield Bible, in an attempt to get Christians to support the establishment of the State of Israel and other Zionist goals. However, the Christian Zionists believe that all the Jews will convert to Christianity with the return of Jesus, while the Jews believe that everyone else will convert to a soft form of Judaism through the enforcement of the Noahide laws upon the entire world. I am reminded of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, where the Marxists and the Islamists worked together, both intending to betray each other once the Shah was overthrown, with the Islamists gaining the upper hand and then purging the Marxists. To be clear, physical messianism is not a belief held by all Jews, but it is a belief held by Chabad, who are incredibly influential and arguably the largest and most powerful Orthodox Jewish group in the world currently. They have thousands of embassies all over the world, and as such the actions they take as a group to bring about the world to come should be viewed with not exactly suspicion but caution. We have seen previously in history how ideological groups with global transformative goals can wreak incredible havoc on the lives of those around them, while simultaneously making their motivations incredibly hard to understand for those who do not understand the ideology at play. You are not allowed to say this, but I do not think it is a stretch to say that the impulse for world government, universal law, and progressive ideals that typify much of the progressive horror that the world has had to endure in this century can be traced directly back to extreme forms of Judaism. The Tikkun Olam is not a Christian or a Muslim idea. The Christians believe in good acts and helping thy neighbor, but in Christianity the world is fallen and can only be perfected by the second coming, an event which humans cannot affect and whose timing is unknown. The only version of this in Islam seems to be the idea of conquering and converting the entire world until the Ummah, or the Islamic community, encompasses the entire planet. Nor does Islam concern itself with ideas such as social justice. It is only in the West, which has a large population of Jews, that the ideas of Tikkun Olam have become public policy. Many Gentiles, of course, have never heard this phrase, and they would probably accuse you of being an anti-Semite if you even voiced such an opinion. While Chabad, again, is not representative of all world Jewry, they are a very tight-knit and influential global group, and the idea of any global group believing they can influence the world through actions to bring about a perfect world is cause for concern. Additionally, it is clear that despite the protestations that the Olam Haba will be good for everyone, it is clear that the main beneficiary of such a system would be the Jews themselves. It is a curious mixture of force and peace. The idea that through the use of force, world peace and justice can be implemented, glossing over the incredible and destructive changes to various nations and faith groups that would be required to bring this about. I cannot help but draw comparisons to the way that Western democracies also spout similar views, that the next war will be the one that spreads global democracy to a grateful global population, or the tenets of globalism that everyone can be made to live under one universal morality. The implementation of such a plan would be sure to bring global war and destruction. Indeed, from the Christian perspective, this sounds very much like the rule of the Antichrist predicted in Revelations.